Okay, we should be live now. I'm hoping this is working well. We have comments available in the bottom there. Hopefully people are able to see this. I'm going to tweet out the link to see if there's anybody I can catch on Twitter as well. Hopefully we will get as many people as possible for a Sunday night, even though we're all snowed in. I've misplaced my link for Twitter. Hold on. Tweet all. I've tweeted it all now. I have people joining the chat, which is good. None of the people from my class yet, though, which could be a disappointing sign. We'll see. We'll see who makes it on. I've made this available publicly, so I'm hoping that people who aren't my friends are able to see this. I've done the Facebook Live a couple of times now, and my students encouraged me to. At least one student had said that it was a good way to broadcast things, but we'll have to see if it works or not. I will record this though, and if we have any problems, then I can of course send it out via YouTube to my students afterwards. So we'll see how this goes. I'm going to give it a couple more minutes before I get going in earnest here. There's the links to the slides are up on in that description of the video, so you should be able to see it there. You also have questions if you want to ask any questions. I'm going to make that available, I think, for the duration of the week. So students who haven't had a chance to look at this tonight on Sunday night can go ahead and ask questions later. We'll see if that works. Just a little bit of housekeeping before I get started for the people who are watching, maybe who aren't sort of sure what it is that I'm doing here. I have a class that I teach at Newman University called Language, Media, and the Internet. It's the first time that I'm teaching this class. I haven't gone through all the slides yet for the whole of the module, so I've been working my way through it. We started off by talking about so-called old media for the first couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks at a time, just talking about media in general. And we've been moving more and more into talking about new media and social media the last couple of weeks. So that's been kind of the starting point of the discussion today. We talked about storytelling on Thursday. Was the last class that we've had. So I'm coming back kind of on the back half of talking about storytelling. Could somebody in the chat, if there's anybody who's actually watching, maybe let me know if the sound is working okay or not. And if the sound is working, then I will go ahead and get going. I also can't seem to tell. I do have a link. I do have a like now from somebody who I'm not friends with. So that must mean that that people can see it, even if they aren't necessarily. I see them on the joined part. Anybody who's watching can hear me okay? Well, I'm not seeing any chats come up, so I'm gonna have to, I think, just keep going here. Okay, so a little bit more background. So the reason I'm making up this class on a Sunday night at 8 o'clock is I'm traveling to Japan on Tuesday. I usually teach this class on a Thursday morning, and I am going to be in Japan at that time. I'm going to a conference called the English Scholars Beyond Borders (ESBB) conference. So if you want to take a look at that website, a really interesting conference about sort of about English language teaching in general. I'm going to be talking about sort of the future of English language and where methods for research in English language are at the moment. So I'm looking forward to that trip, and I'm hoping to for this English language or language, media, and the internet class to have the students are going to be leading a discussion by themselves. I hope on Thursday we are going to see if that works or not. But like I said, we've been talking about different kinds of issues with media and technologically mediated communication, sort of more generally, and this last week we were talking about storytelling, and anybody who knows anything about my research knows that storytelling is something that I'm really interested in. I'm interested in social media storytelling in particular, and how that relates to religion. So in the talk tonight, I'm going to get some examples about from social media and religious interaction. On Thursday, we had a conversation that was really interesting. Actually, we were talking a lot about social media storytelling, like I said, and we had some examples. The students went and looked on different websites and were looking at how people portray themselves online. And it was interesting in the conversation that we were having. For those who were there and will remember, we kind of stumbled into conversations about community in that conversation about storytelling, because what came up was when people were sharing their examples of social media people who were posting on Instagram or posting on Facebook and presenting themselves in specific ways, was some sense that you needed to understand something about the person who was doing the posting to understand why they were doing what they were doing, right? So Cristiano Ronaldo was one of the ones we were looking at. Fascinating Facebook page if you want to open up another page and get distracted. Take a look at Cristiano Ronaldo's postings, which are pretty interesting. But we were talking about how in this presenting of Cristiano Ronaldo on Facebook, he was creating a story about who he was, which had something to do with him being, well, of course, a good football player. That was part of it. But it was also about him being a good father, and it was also about him being kind of, well, his postings about his work were interesting in the sense that he posts about him doing like advertising work, or posts about him doing photo shoots and that kind of thing. But it's about those photo shoots of advertising as his job, and not really about him trying to sell something. So it's this really interesting kind of two narratives going on. One where he's selling something, and you can tell that there's a picture of him being taken for an advert, but it's a picture of him taking a picture. And so you have this kind of backdoor look at his life. And then I gave a presentation, and in that presentation went on to talk about Casey Neistat, who's a YouTuber who does the same kind of thing in the videos that we looked at, where he's presenting himself. He's a celebrity, and he's presenting himself doing celebrity type things, but at the same time, there's this kind of I keep using the metaphor for the back door, which probably isn't the best one, but the sort of backstage. Backstage is better than backdoor. Backstage view of him living his life. And what was interesting about that conversation was it creates a kind of feeling of attachment to whoever it is that you're looking at. Maybe Cristiano Ronaldo's a bad example because he's more famous for football than for being a social media star. But certainly with Casey Neistat, a sense that you are connected to him as a kind of I don't know, figure online. And there's a kind of community that emerges around him, and those communities, those YouTube communities, we could talk about not just Neistat's community, but YouTubers are famous for sort of naming their community groups of people around them. The Paul brothers. I don't know for those of you who follow YouTube as closely as I do. You have as miserable a life as I do in terms of your entertainment that you follow. You will know about the Paul brothers, and they've been recently in trouble for kind of pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable behavior online. Anyway, they both name their communities not very creative necessarily. The Jake Paul, people who follow Jake Paul, he calls the Jake Paulers. And Logan Paul's group is a little bit more interesting. They're called the Low Gang. But there's a sense of community around them, or they're trying to create a sense of community around them. And in the conversation we were having on Thursday, we got a bit critical about this because, you know, the Cristiano Ronaldo example is good in the sense that he's explicitly selling something to you. He's selling, well, in the case of the picture we were looking at, it was just, you know, shampoo. But you know, there's a case of a whole bunch of different things that he's selling. I'm sorry, I don't know how good the microphone is, if it's picking up the sound in my house as well. I've sounds like my partner is doing the dishes at the moment. If it gets to be too loud, maybe I'll go in there and ask her to stop for the moment. But I'm seeing the little what do you call it, the thumbs coming across the screen. So I like that. I can't tell if that's a good thing or a bad thing, or what it actually represents. I was just having a discussion with my brother actually about what thumbing something up actually represented or not. But anyway, I digress. So I put up the slides for the talk. I'm not going to do kind of a slide sharing thing. I'm going to keep the camera on myself, but kind of talk through the different slides that I have up here. Again, for the students who are watching this later, you can go back and look at them. They're posted on the Moodle site, and should be the kind of things that you need to inform you for the conversation on Thursday. So we started off this conversation talking about what using that word community, and I was using it in a kind of an uncritical way, talking about, well, I say it in an uncritical way. I use the word community because that's the word that people like Jake Paul use and people like Logan Paul use. I think as academics, we get caught up in words and we're like, yeah, but is that really a community? And what do you mean by community? And what exactly is a community? Those are all, of course, important questions. But from my perspective as a discourse analyst and a person interested in media conversations, I'm interested in the words that people use to describe their own interaction. And if people say they're a part of a community, well, then there you go. That should be enough for us as analysts to say that word is it's a word at least worth considering and thinking about what they mean by that when they're using it, and then as academics, how we might want to parse that word a little bit more carefully. Since we've been talking kind of about production and consumption of media, community is an interesting aspect in relationship to this, because now media consumption happens in these kind of community settings where you might be getting information from someone. Well, Cristiano Ronaldo is a bit of a maybe a bad example of this, but you could be getting information from someone like that in the social media world that you're in. And so we can talk about communities being sort of organized in different ways. We've been talking about them being oriented around performers in this case, but I think if I asked anybody here, what kind of internet communities do you feel a part of? You might give different examples of what that is. I talk regularly about sort of the Facebook community that I'm a part of. I'll use the word community in talking about my Facebook friends, and for me, that is, it means that it's a place where I feel. Well, it's interesting. What do I mean by when I talk about a community on Facebook? I guess it is a sense of feeling like there are people who care about me, people who are interested in what's going on in my life, people who in some way are living life with me. And I think as we look at kind of the different ways we're describing community in this presentation, we might think about the extent to which YouTube friends or Facebook friend circles or Twitter or whatever kind of social media platform we're using, if it's appropriate to talk about them in terms of communities. But I'm interested in the students and anyone else watching to be thinking about what kind of internet communities do they think that they're a part of, how they would consider themselves to be a member of a community, an internet community in particular. Now, some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about tonight, so Susan Herring's examples of internet community or online community that I'm going to draw on a little bit later in the talk. We're considering something that's a bit older, right? Almost exclusively pre what we would call Web 2.0, this point in the history of the internet where people started producing content as well as consuming it, and where social media sort of begins to take off in 2006, 2007, 2008. We're thinking about a time before Facebook even existed, and at that point when we're talking about community, I think you're thinking about sort of text-based, forum-based kinds of places for people to interact, and that's a different kind of community than we might conceive of now, especially with this in the case where we're talking about like my friends on Facebook and whether or not we're a community or not. What we've also been talking an awful lot about in this class is whether or not technology is really doing anything new or not, or whether or not we're just doing what we do offline and it's just being mediated in a new way in online spaces. And community is also worth considering in light of that. Kind of what about this, my Facebook friends, is similar or different from what's happening offline and the friend groups that I might have offline as well. We've also talked an awful lot about how social media is putting us in a place where what is kind of your online life and what is your offline life have converged in a way more so than you would have had pre-social media, maybe not pre-social media, but pre the smartphone. The smartphone has really made it so that we are starting to interact in a way where our kind of that online and those online and offline lives are converging in a real difficult way, I think, probably to really pull apart as analysts. And where before we could say you went online and you had an online community and then you had your offline communities, your lived experiences, those two things are difficult to really differentiate. Now I'm looking at the people, my Facebook friends who are watching this now, or Facebook tells me that they're watching. Some of them I've met everybody in real life, but I didn't initially meet everybody on that list in real life first. So there's people that I met in online context and then eventually met in offline context afterwards. So it's worth thinking about when you think about the communities that you're part of, the things that you feel belonging in, places that you feel belonging in, online spaces, where those are, and how they differ from offline spaces. I have a definition of community here. One of these sorts of you can find a lot of different definitions of what community is, and we'll get that a little bit further. But just as a starting point, this definition of community is just from a participatory public health article on public health. And again, it's in the slides if you want to have a look at it. It's a common definition of community: emerged as a group of people with diverse characteristics who are linked by social ties, share common perspectives, and engage in joint action in geographic locations or settings. Which I think sort of picks up on the main things that I'd want to talk about as sort of a historic view of what a community is, particularly that geographic bit. And if we think about how we think about communities before technology begins to mediate it in a real in a way that is we have now, where it's such an integral part of our lives. If we move back to a point before smartphones, before laptops and computers and stuff, and even before travel becomes a kind of common thing for people to do, before automobiles, you keep moving back and back and back, you're going to get to a core understanding of community that's going to have to do with geography, because that's where people would be living, and the only connection that you would have would be the people around you. And so your community in that case, if you start to think about it historically, community is going to be connected to your sense of place, and there's going to be some relationship not only to the place that you live, but also probably there'll be some familial or some ethnic connections that that will tie you together with the people that you're around. Certainly things like language, shared culture, all those sorts of things. And those are really tied to geography. Now, as we move forward in time, and technology allows us to kind of time travel and space travel in a way that we haven't been able to before. We can start to find connections in new ways. So it's not just my family that I feel a connection to. I can feel connection to people that we have other shared characteristics around. And that's that point about this definition of community that I like. It picks up that fact about social ties or common perspectives. Those are things that we might feel a community relationship around. And that, when we think about things like fan communities in particular, that might be something that is tied together. Why you would have somebody in the same who likes the same thing that you do, and you have nothing else in common except the fact that you're fans of one of the Paul brothers, or fans of Harry Potter, whatever kind of fan community it would be that you're thinking of. There's also this point about joint action, and we're going to get to that as we talk about community of practice a bit later. There is something about doing things together too that can be a part about building community. It's not just about shared perspectives, but that shared perspective might be tied to something concrete, like a task that you do or a group that you're a part of. That membership could also be something that is mediated by an institution as well, and that complicates things also in terms of if I have so far, I think my way I've been talking about community, I've been using language that talks about belonging and a feeling that I have that I'm a part of a community. But if you think about, so this class is for Newman University, and all the students are, at least on paper, they have cards that say that they are members of Newman University, that community. Whether or not you feel a sense of belonging in that community or not could be, well, it's less important than the fact that you have a lanyard around your neck that says student with a card with your name on it. So we have this idea potentially that maybe historically understanding community would be easier because it's geographic and it's about institutions and that sort of thing. But actually, it can be quite problematic in institutions as well. I attend a church in Harborne, where I live. That church is a community with members and an institution that has some sort of gatekeeping device. I attend this church regularly. I don't have any shared belief. I guess I shouldn't say I shouldn't have any shared belief. I don't have a shared core belief with the people in the church, but I do think that I'm a member of that community, and I feel a member of that community, even though I don't have. I'm not actually a member of the church. I don't actually. I don't actually have membership at all. My first daughter appearance, it's like that viral video. Do you want to say hello to everyone before you go to bed? Yeah, come over here and say hello. So, I don't think she can't see anybody, but this is my daughter Mia, who's going to bed. Can you say good night to everyone?
Good night.
Good night. Okay, that'll be the most popular part of the video, probably. Okay, can you go now? So. I need to go like there. I get some thumbs up. That's what I get the thumbs up for. Is the kids kind of done. Where was I? I was talking about being part of a church that I'm not actually a member of, and I don't believe anything anyone else believes. But I go, and I'm a member of that community because this is it's tied to a. I guess it's a complicated thing, I guess, is what I'm saying, to try to figure out what counts as community and who's a member of your community, even if we're talking about something institutional. I don't think we have any examples at Newman University of somebody who is just sort of hanging out, but isn't actually a member of the community, who doesn't work there, or who doesn't pay fees to go to classes, but still shows up. If I think of anybody, I'll have to say that later. But generally, people at Newman are members of the community in some sort of institutional way. I don't know why you would be there if you weren't. Anyway, so in my point about understanding community is that we have this connection between what came before and what we have now. I've made this point also in the class several times, which is you can't understand any technology that appears or that comes onto the scene. And I mean technology here, I'm using probably too broadly. I'm using this to sort of describe both instruments like things like smartphones, but also platforms as well. So I've said regularly to students, that you understand Facebook or how Facebook works because of some experience that you had with technology before that. And if Facebook was your first interaction with social media, well, then Facebook will, in some way, shape how you use social media going forward. So we had this conversation. We were talking about Facebook status updates and this article by Ruth Page from 2010. Anyone who's read that article by Ruth Page, she's talking about status updates as stories and how people build up stories over time using status updates. Really interesting article. The students, though, as they were looking at it, were not confused, but the way that Facebook used to work, 10 years ago. Is it 10 years ago? Yeah, we're talking 9 years ago, 9 or 10 years ago, where and I probably my older friends will remember this, that you had it didn't ask you. Now Facebook asks you when you go on what's on your mind, and you put in something that's on your mind. Before it used to say like Stephen is, and I would have to finish that statement. People might remember that or not. But anyway, when that changed to what's on your mind, I remember that everyone had, went crazy, of course, because who wants to, have a change to the the platform that they're using, and eventually we got used to it. But that idea of like that Stephen is that status update way of shaping things or shaping those status updates then affected how I used it going forward. So that's the point that I'm making here, is that what you did in the past has some sort of way of thinking about how you do things in the future. Or in the present, whatever technology you have in front of you. So if you have email, you write it as you would write a letter beforehand, and as time changes and you get more used to it, sort of the ways that you can use it, the affordances, the things that are possible to use about it become things that you exploit in new ways. But again, your starting point with it is an offline or previous technology. So my point here is that if we're talking about kind of how we approach community online, we have to start by thinking about how we approach community offline. So if you're a part of a church community offline, for example, then you would find yourself attracted to people of the same faith online as well. If things like a shared a sports team potentially is important to you, you might find yourself attracted to a community of sports teams online, or not sports teams, probably your sports team, the one sports team you're interested in. I'm not a big sports fan, as you can tell. What was the other example I was thinking of? Sports teams, religion. The big ones. Beer, sports teams, religion, and beer. Beer was the other example that I was thinking of. So let's say there's a particular kind of beer that you were interested in, or a particular way of like making beer. My neighbor is interested in different kinds of microbreweries, and so if you're interested you're in a community of people who are interested in microbrews offline, you'd be interested in the same sort of thing online as well. Now that said, all those examples I gave are sort of ones where you could find a community. If you're interested in microbrews in Birmingham, it's easy enough to find that community offline, and there's no stigma around it here as well. As far as I can tell, maybe there is. There's no stigma around baseball teams. There's no stigma around most of the major religions, at least in a multicultural city like Birmingham. But you could think of something like atheism, and this is one thing that's come up in my research quite a bit. If you think about being an atheist in a majority religion culture where, let's say, the majority of the people around you, your family, your friends, everybody is a Christian, and you're an atheist, and there's nobody around you that you know who is an atheist, then the one thing that the internet might afford you is the possibility to start a community that you don't have offline, which is a community of people who are atheists like you. There's interesting research around different kinds of communities like this, transsexual, transgendered groups. If going back in time, well, I mean, even now in places where homosexuality is still culturally less acceptable, people might find communities of people sharing the same understandings of gender and sexuality that you wouldn't be able to find in your day-to-day sort of geographic communities. So in that point about saying the ways that the internet is the same and different, that bit about it being different and providing something new actually does, in this case, it does provide something new to people who are interested in building communities that they wouldn't potentially have contact with offline as well. So I set an activity for students this week and asking them to go and look for a community and to do a little bit of writing about it. You might look for communities like this where there's a group of people who are interacting with each other on Reddit or whatever around something that maybe is potentially not as maybe not as socially acceptable as it would as things like microbrews or I don't know, Harry Potter or whatever we could think of as being something that is acceptable in offline lives. There's one other point that I was thinking I wanted to make here. Momsnet. We talked about Momsnet as well a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago. We talked about how Momsnet creates a kind of community of people as well. And now, of course, you could have a connection of moms in an offline space where you would, there's a bunch of people around you who are moms and you're all moms together and you feel a sense of community with those people. But the article that we read on Momsnet was about kind of talking about children in a way that was less, I don't know, maybe say less socially acceptable. It was all about joking about selling your kids off. Which so it's all about that, but that was one of the major themes in it. And potentially what you could find in that situation is, even though there is a world in which you can be in a mom's community offline, you are able to be maybe more open or more free in a way that you wouldn't necessarily be able to be in your offline world or your geographic world, because you're meeting people who are maybe more judgmental of you in that situation, or you feel like they might be more judgmental of you, or there might be something about the anonymity of being online that allows you to feel a little bit more inhibition or freedom to say what you actually say. So we have this sort of bunch of different examples now that I've given where we could have something where it's like more or less the same as it is offline, one which is completely impossible offline and is made possible in online spaces, and then something in the middle which is sort of it's borrowing from both worlds, which I suspect if we move back to talking about social media and Facebook, I suspect Facebook in this client of things is somewhere in the middle there, where I can have interaction with people that I wouldn't necessarily have interaction with in offline spaces, but the online Facebook apparatus gives me some sort of affordance to interact in a new or an interesting way with them. So I've touched on a couple of these different examples. If you're following along on the slides, I talked about Facebook friends, Twitter a little bit. I said a subreddit of a particular celebrity might be an example of that Cristiano Ronaldo thing where his Facebook page, I haven't had a close look at that at all to see how kind of regularly people are posting on it, but I was thinking more about a subreddit. Subreddits are more, if you go to reddit.com and you look at the different kinds of communities that are there, in a subreddit, you might have a group of people who are interacting regularly around their interest in a particular online celebrity or a particular band or some sort of interest there. And you could find members who were, maybe interacting there for a very long time. I've never really gotten into Reddit myself, but I do know that it is a kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Durable text-based set of communities that that doesn't do video, doesn't do audio in the way that you might find on Facebook or on Snapchat. It's still very text-based and still about people responding to each other in threads, in forums. So it's an interesting kind of holdover of that era. I also put in here people playing World of Warcraft together, which again is not something that I'm very interested in myself, but it did come up in our class a couple of times where people were talking about playing. one of those shooty games. Call of Duty, I think. Was it Call of Duty we were talking about? Someone will have to correct me if later in class it was Call of Duty we were talking about. But Call of Duty is something that you could be doing. You could play with people online, have a community online, but you could also have something where you're interacting with each other and talking to each other in forums as well, or in offline spaces too, where you share a kind of shared interest in a game like that. So if we're thinking about what makes these communities or not, or what would be the markers of community, I want us just to kind of have all these ideas in our heads of different things that we could think of as being potential communities, now that we try to apply some sort of theory to try to figure out what it is that we can apply them to. Now, I have put on the Moodle, and I'm sorry about this for the people who are watching and aren't actually members of the class. I did a rather cheeky thing. I don't know if it's a cheeky thing or not, but I've done quite a bit of writing about community in my PhD thesis. There's a whole subsection on it, and as I was looking for a good summary of this, of different kinds of models of community for this class, I couldn't find what I was looking for except this bit of writing that I had done for my thesis. So I extracted that and posted it on the Moodle. Never fear if you are really interested in finding this. I wouldn't suggest it for fun reading on a Sunday night, but different a load of references about communities and different ways of looking at communities from a communications perspective. You can download my PhD thesis from the Open University. I think it's still available there, and there's not much going on in that document as a whole, but if you search for community and are interested in those references, they're all there. So, but for the students who are watching this, I've extracted it. You can have a look at it. But basically, there's sort of different ways you can think about community that I've sort of summarized. One being about thinking about location and these sort of ethnic ties that I've already alluded to. So community, in this case, we're thinking about community as being where you are. That's a pretty in some ways, I guess, is a pretty simple way of looking at it. But again, we can complicate this in a lot of ways by thinking about, well, I live in a particular place in Birmingham, and this particular place in Birmingham, we're all living together, but we might have splits that will become apparent in terms of class differences, in terms of ethnic differences, in terms of religious differences, where we might be living very close to each other, even in proximity, very close proximity to one another, and actually not have that sense of belonging together. So I guess I want to make the point that it wasn't that it's not that technology really complicates ideas of community. These sort of problems that are always there, we tend to kind of look at them in different ways in physical locations. But anyway, you could think about community in terms of where you are. You could also think about community in terms of who you are as well. So I could say, well, I'm an American in the UK, and that's my identity. So I belong to the American in the Americans in the UK community. I tend to try to avoid those people, and all the other Americans that I know too. I don't think anybody's really amped up when we see another American. It's not sort of like, finally somebody from my community, somebody who understands me. We're all sort of like, oh, yeah, we're all kind of, particularly with the current presidents, everybody sort of looks down and goes, like, I think it's best if we just avoid each other. I'm joking, of course, but you could think about the opposite of that being sort of my partner is Japanese, and whenever I'm around communities of people who are Japanese, we just had a party on yesterday of a group of Japanese people in the UK, and their experience of being around each other is much different, I think, than the Americans. There's a kind of a shared identity that is it's quite compelling, I think, or very important. So you could talk about who you are, whether that's about ethnicity or shared language or shared nationality. Talk about it in terms of speech community, which has been a big one in linguistics, sociolinguistics. And if you took I teach a class called Language, Society, and Power in the autumn, and we spend a lot of time talking about speech communities in that class. So for students can go back and take a look at those readings if they're interested in. But that one's more focused on how you speak. It could be about in terms of different languages altogether, but it could be also around kind of the dialect of English that you speak as well. We're going to talk a little bit about community of practice tonight, and that's sort of looking at the way that in which you focus on things that you do rather than who you are or the location that you're in. So sort of community of practice stuff comes from research into things about apprenticeship, and so how do you become I don't know, how do you become a teacher? How do you become a blacksmith, sort of historically? I have a student who's doing a project right now on police officers and looking at police officers as communities of practice. So how do you become an expert police officer? And that, again, it's not about your identity. It's not about how you speak. It's not about where you are necessarily. It's about this job that somebody might do and how they learn to become a part of that community. And I had fan communities here. That's not in my writing from the thesis, but that was the one that we came up with on Thursday. We started talking about Ronaldo and the YouTubers, and this is a sort of community based on who you like, which I think is an interesting way of thinking about community as well. And it differs from kind of what you do, how you speak, and who you are and where you are. I'm not going to talk about that too much, but it's worth keeping that in mind going forward. I mentioned this Herring model of community from 2004, and you can look at kind of what she had to say about what are the markers of community. Slide number 7 in my list there. So if you're thinking about community from Herring's model, these sort of characteristics of things that she picks up on, I've included here because I think that they continue to be important for us in thinking about how we describe communities and how we describe whatever it is that we the different examples that I've given so far, and if we want to try to differentiate between them, one of the things that models or theories allow us to do is to talk real specifically about differences between things. So if we're going to talk about what the difference between a World of Warcraft community is and a Facebook community, we need some sort of categories to talk about them, why they're different, and we can do that in kind of a lay analyst way, where we would say, however it is that your mom or your dad would describe them being different. We are trying to move away from that in doing sort of expert analysis of things. So we need to think about categories generally in trying to differentiate between things. So Herring's thinks that the 5 things that she brings up are structure, meaning, interaction, social behavior, and participation. Those are the kind of the 5 things that she's thinking about. Structure, she puts language into that. So like jargon, the things that you would say, or the words that you would know. So the Jake Paulers, for example, the people who follow Jake Paul would be used to the kinds of things that he says, or whatever the kind of in languages that occurs in Jake Paul videos. There's something about meaning as well, and understanding meaning in relationship to the other people in the group. This relates to things like knowledge, which was one of the issues that came up in this storytelling class that we had on Thursday, where somebody presented, someone that they followed online, and they said, well, to understand what this guy is doing, you've got to understand, the ongoing story that's a part of what he's been doing in the Snapchat for the last, 5 years or whatever. 5 years is probably too long for Snapchat, but for the last year, there's kind of an ongoing joke. That's a kind of knowledge that builds up in a group of people. You consider that to be a marker of community. In offline spaces, you'd have the same sort of thing. You go to a church, for example, and there's a kind of knowledge that you need to have to be a part of what's going on there. Interaction is an important one here as well, and one of the things I guess is important as we sort of differentiate between somebody who views a Jake Paul video or somebody who views a Casey Neistat video, and then somebody who's a part of the community. So how do you differentiate between that? Well, you can differentiate in a couple of different ways. One being, are people interacting with each other? So if you're just watching Jake Paul videos, you're probably not a Jake Pauler. You have to have some sort of interaction with the video or with the other people in the community. Although, as I think about that and I say it, it's a complicated thing to talk about. What counts as interaction with something like a YouTube video? So if I'm just watching a video every day and I'm liking it every day, does that count as interaction or not? If I subscribe to somebody, does that count as interaction or not? Next thing is social behavior. She says this is kind of a solidarity, conflict management, norms of appropriateness, which I think are interesting as well. So the things that you can and can't do. Momsnet's a good example of this, probably, where you could say, well, we were talking about the Jay McKenzie article about joking about selling your kids, right? And as a social behavior on Momsnet, that was okay because everybody kind of knew that they were joking around, there was something about the norms of the group that everybody understood that made that possible. We talked sort of about the linguistic devices, but I mean, Jay talks about it in her article, but we talked about it in the class as well, kind of like linguistically what people are doing to kind of make the point that they're joking and not not being serious about actually wanting to sell their kids. But then again, there are things that are absolutely inappropriate to do there and could get you banned from the group. So that those norms of appropriateness go both ways in terms of the things you're supposed to do and the things you shouldn't do as well. And if we think about sort of social media groups as well, we could say, well, you think about Facebook friends as communities, there might be different norms for different groups or different networks of people. So if you come on my Facebook page and you make fun of me, which is some of my Facebook friends enjoy doing, and it doesn't offend me, I quite enjoy it. I think it's fun. It's a part of the interaction. That is a kind of a norm for appropriateness that's okay in my group of friends, my network of friends. But if you go and you do the same thing on somebody else's page, they might be totally offended and it might not be acceptable there. And then participation is another thing about it too. So you can do all these things, but you have to do them over time to become a community. You can't just do it one time. You have to go back and back. I've been using this example that the church is a physical location place. I think it's telling because when we moved to this area, like I said, my partner's a Christian and wanted to go sort of immediately to this church, and we kind of went on and off for a while, and then we started going very regularly, like almost every week, and did that for almost a year, I think, before people sort of noticed that we were there, which was it sounds a very British thing from my perspective. I think Americans would be hopping all over you, be your best friend by week 2. But in this country, it was kind of a slow burn. And finally, after about a year, people were like, "Have you been here before?" Like, yeah, we sit in the second pew right up front all the time. You apparently haven't noticed us yet. So participation is an important part of this. I kind of stumbled into a point that I had been intending to make earlier. So what happens when you give a lecture that you haven't given before and are doing it online as well. The point that I wanted to make was that communities are scalable in different places as well. So you could think about community, the Facebook community as a whole, like everybody on Facebook together. But then you can think about it in terms of the networks of friends that are around particular people also. And if I apply these sort of 5 different criteria, we could talk about, well, if there's things you need to know just to be a part of Facebook, and then there are things that you need to know to be a friend of mine on Facebook and to be appropriate in that situation. So it's scalable in terms of thinking about it in a macro scale or a micro scale. But this also applies to geographic location as well. You could think about the UK as a community. You could think about Birmingham as a community. You could think about Harborne, where I am, as a community. You could think about the postcode I live in. You could think about the street. You could think about the 3 people who are living around me, and you go down to my family, you know? And so all these things would, if we're thinking about structure, meaning, interaction, social behavior, and participation, all 5 of those things would apply in different ways at each one of those different scales. So, as we're thinking about relationships between online and offline communities, we need to look for analogies between the two, and particularly because a lot of the offline or a lot of the online stuff is motivated by offline language and offline structures. So if you talk about Facebook, for example, if we're talking about friends, that's an offline understanding of relationships that's brought to the online world. And even the word community, the word community is one that comes before the internet, and something we applied to talk about offline worlds before we even had a computer. So we are taking offline ideas and applying them in online spaces. Okay, so I talked about Susan Herring's description of online communities here. I want to talk about one other model of communities, which if you did my Language Society and Power class, you'll remember we talked about community of practice a little bit. And I bring up this model not because I think that it's the best model of communities at all. It's just one that I think it's useful for us I'm giving it to you as a theory that we're going to talk a little bit about, and then you can go out and use the activity that I've given you for this week, where I'm asking you to look at a particular community and apply these different terms to them. So I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but this was about community of practice is about communities oriented around people who are doing things together. And that doesn't mean that they don't have relationships that are identity-based or geographic-based as well. You could have a community of practice that's all in the same place, or you could have a community of practice that's all likes the same sorts of things. But it's a way of orienting our thought about community away from things like ethnicity and geography, but towards activities. So we're thinking about what people are doing as opposed to who they are. And the nice thing about what a community practice model allows us to think about is who in a community, everyone's not an equal member of a community of practice. If you think about the examples here that come up in this the slide that I have on community of practice, it talks about a band of artists working together, a tribe learning to survive, a group of engineers working on similar problems, pupils working together in a school. You could have surgeons working together. You could have managers working together who are doing the same kinds of things. All those groups of people are in some way focused on an activity, and from that activity, then they have a sense of community that emerges around them. The point that I wanted to make was that of those kinds of groups of people together, if you think about, let's say, surgeons, we'll use surgeons as the example. There are different sort of there's different levels at which you could be a surgeon or have the kind of knowledge of surgery. So if you think about somebody who's been a surgeon for 40 years and who's developed a bunch of different new techniques about surgery, has taught a bunch of people how to do surgery, has performed thousands and thousands of surgeries, has written books or whatever, that person would be kind of a core member of that community, be a very important person in that community. Whereas you'd have somebody who is just starting out in surgery, who's maybe a student who hasn't performed any surgeries before. They're still in some way a member of that community. They're still a surgeon, but they're more on the periphery of that community than the person who is at the center of it. You could have anybody in between there, right? So you have this sense of this core members, people who are the kind of the keepers of the community, the people who are the most important people in the community in terms of the knowledge, in terms of their experiences. And then you have people on the periphery. Now, those people in the core are not necessarily structurally the people at the core. And what I mean by that is if we think about communities in terms of institutions, let's think about Newman University as an example. Scott Davidson is the VC, and So in terms of like the membership in the community of Newman, like he's the most important one. You know, he's the guy who's the head of the organization tree. But if you think about what member of the community knows the most about Newman, knows the most about the culture of Newman, I wouldn't say that it's Scott. Scott's only been there for about 18 months now, maybe a year and a half. He hasn't been around that long yet. I mean, he understands the ethos of the university very well and understands how things work there. But there are people who are members of the community who've been there for a much longer time, who understand how things work, who understand the networks of knowledge, who understand how you talk at Newman, who understand how the food services work. I mean, there's so many different things that you need to know about to really understand how the community of Newman works. And there are members of the community at Newman who will be there after Scott, who have been there long before Scott was there, and after Scott retires or moves on, will be a member of that community still. So it's not a structural hierarchy thing. It's about knowledge, it's about action, and it's about understanding the culture of it. Now there's communities of practice. Theory has ways of describing this, and this is why it's useful, I think, for you to go out and give it a go. Again, I'm not giving this to you to say that this is the only model of community or it is the best model of community. I'm saying it's one that is a useful way of thinking about communities that can be helpful for you in doing analysis if you're looking at a group of people and saying, okay, how can I describe what it is that they are, what it is that they're doing? So community of practice has these three parts to it. If you're following along on the slides, this is number 10, talking about three things: mutual engagement, joint negotiated enterprise, and a shared repertoire of negotiable resources. Now, if you have a look at this, and this is classic community of practice theory stuff, you can, if you read it, do any kind of basic reading about community of practice, you'll see these three terms come up. What do they mean? Well, they're going to all sound really familiar, actually, to kinds of the things that we were talking about with the Herring model of online communities. Talk about mutual engagement. So engagement is an important part of it, where you're interacting regularly between community members. And this is where, when we talk about Newman and we talk about who are the core members of the Newman community, and how you can't see that necessarily on an organization tree, it might be that there are people who are doing a lot of engagement with people on sort of the day-to-day life of the university that actually, in terms of the organizational chart, are in the middle somewhere. They're not top members, they're not bottom members, they're somewhere in the middle. And they're people like, and some of them are my Facebook friends, people like Margaret Holland, who is the chaplain at the university. If you want to know about how Newman works, you probably should talk to her. She knows an awful lot about how it works. She's been there for a while, will probably be there for a while in the future as well. So there's something about engagement. Margaret interacts with a lot of people at the university. That joint negotiated enterprise, that second bit of it, is something about that doing, the community of practice, the practice part of it, the doing part of it, is that we're all trying to accomplish a kind of similar type of thing. And whatever that thing is that we're doing, we're trying to work towards it together. Now, this is a difficult thing to sometimes put a name on, because if you look at Newman University as an example, what's the shared goal of Newman University? Like, what is Newman trying to do? Well, it's tricky to put a simple kind of a definition on that. As analysts, we could think of different ways of describing it, but there is something that goes beyond kind of, well, I guess Newman's, the main thing, the basic on the tin thing that Newman is doing is that it's educating students, but we could talk about how that education of students is different and unique at Newman as it is to the University of Birmingham or some other place. But that's a goal. That's the thing that we're talking about, the practice part of the community practice. And then the other bit of it is a shared repertoire of negotiable resources. Now, I know big words, the complicated words have been a bit of a problem in our class. But repertoire of negotiable resources just means the kind of knowledge that we have about the thing it is that we're doing. And And if you look at the slide, it breaks it down into a couple of different things. I shouldn't say it's only knowledge, because it's made up of things like relationships. It's made up in ways of doing things. I guess that relates to knowledge. Mutual defining identities, specific tools, representations, and other artifacts, and then kind of like the shared stories, the inside jokes, that kind of stuff. Now, part of that is knowledge in the sense of the things that you know, but there are also things that you have that you that are a part of the doing, or the interacting with other people. So the identities that you have, and the possible relationships that you have within a different organization. But you need to have all these sorts of things for a community to be a community, and not something else, not just a group of people who are I don't know, liking the same YouTube video, for example. One of the interesting things about this community of practice model, which I like more so than saying something generic like community is about a sense of belonging, or like a feeling like people are caring for you, but it has something about the relationships and those ongoing relationships, and they don't necessarily have to be harmonious, which I think is an important thing. So they make the point that relationships can also be relationships of conflict as well. And I've seen this a lot on YouTube, for example, where you have communities of people interacting where they aren't necessarily friends with each other. You know, there's atheists and Christians who are interacting for a very long period of time. They have ongoing mutual relationships. They have all sort of the things that you would find in terms of the other markers of the community of practice, but they don't like each other, and they certainly wouldn't say that they're members of the same community. But if you look at them objectively, you look at them from a third perspective, they are actually living together, doing a similar kind of thing together, and do have a relationship, a set of knowledge, all these sorts of things that, for all intents and purposes, makes them a community. So if you're thinking, my point here is that basically, if you're trying to say that community is about a sense of belonging, well, that's not going to work in all cases, because there's plenty of communities that you are a part of that you don't necessarily feel like you're a part of, or you might have varying degrees of feeling like you're a part of. Your family might be this too. Sometimes you might feel like you're very strongly associated. You have a very strong sense of belonging in your family, but you aren't always. You don't always feel that way, or it isn't something that's entirely ongoing all the time. So what the community of practice allows us to do is to kind of pick apart whatever community it is that we're talking about, and describe it using those terms. And I've actually asked you to do that for the activity today, and I'll be interested to see how people get on with that. I've asked you to fill out to put together a team of 2 or 3 people, and then to go on to the Moodle and fill in the forum with 3 specific questions about the 3 parts of community practice that I just talked about. So do make sure that you do that this week, and then meet up together on Thursday to talk about the work that you did. And I'll send out an email about this going forward. One of the examples that I wanted to give of this, a concrete example of research, was done by a friend of mine called Tim Hutchings, who wrote a book last year called, well, a book that came out last year called Creating Church Online. And I said my interest is sort of in online interaction around religion. And this book is interesting in the sense that it talks about how communities of religious people, particularly Christians, who are trying to, in some way, do church or make church from an offline perspective, to remake it in an online perspective. And he talks about kind of the histories of people doing this in different spaces. And it's a good example of this kind of movement between your understanding of the world in an offline capacity, and then how you begin to do those same sorts of things in online spaces. The interesting thing about Hutchings' book, and the thing that I wanted to highlight, and I've put is sort of his model of doing analysis of, he calls it mediatized religious design, which I think is an interesting way of talking about how religious interaction happens in online spaces, because it starts to think about artifacts or the content of interaction and the things that people consume in online spaces. And this is important in thinking about kind of the content that's created by somebody like Jake Paul, or somebody, one of the YouTubers, is that the community is, the community is a group of people interacting with each other, but they're interacting around something, around some content being produced, around some sort of person who's doing something and giving them something to talk about. And if that person disappears or the platform disappears, the community falls apart. You can't keep going with the community in the same way that you had before. If in the Creating Church Online book, there are a couple of examples of the platform falling apart, or the place where people are interacting is no longer there, or doesn't continue to exist in the same way. It's like if I have a network of Facebook friends, and let's say Facebook stops existing, that lack of technology means that group of people is going to disband. We're not going to be a community in the same way. Again, this is the same case as it is in the offline world, that if something happens that destroys kind of the connections that you have between people in a geographic sense, for example, let's say you have a community of people who are living in the same place, and then something happens, if there's a drought or something that disperses people, if they don't travel together and go to the same new place together, that community of people is disbanded as well. So it's not so much that it's again a new thing that's happening in the online space. It's just that, well, the durability of a website is probably less durability of the website is less durable. Websites are less durable than geographic spaces or geographic places. I'm coming to the end of my time here. I've given a couple of examples in the slides there of places where you could think about fan communities, or people who are coming together in liking a particular person or liking a particular YouTube channel, and then something happening that challenges that and leads to a place in which, if you don't have the celebrity or the person who's at the center of that group, like all the examples that I gave about the platform changing, where YouTube is the same. If you have a YouTube star who suddenly disappears, or who isn't able to make videos anymore, then that community too will not be as durable as a community in which somebody manages to continue to produce content. And there's two examples I gave. One was the Nerdfighteria community, which is the Hank and John Green's channel. If you look at the Vlog Brothers on YouTube, they've been around for a really long time, and the people in their community have long histories of interacting with each other. They do a lot of things together, and have a kind of durability to them, compared to another YouTuber called Shay Carl, who had a group of he called his community the Shaytards, people who watched him for a very long time. And he was a daily vlogger, was vlogging regularly, and then had a kind of, I say a sex scandal in my slides. He had just been flirting with somebody that it wasn't his wife. He didn't actually have an affair from what I gathered, but it destroyed the channel, because sort of his identity was about being this family man who was clean and wholesome, and then this story came out about him, and that community of the Shaytards. I mean, the potential is probably still there for him to come back eventually and start making videos again, and maybe that community gets reactivated. But the people who were the community of people watching his daily vlogs and interacting around his daily vlogs and building that knowledge and that interaction, that engagement, that group of people doesn't do that anymore. simply because this guy is not there and not making videos. Last point I'll make here, and then I'll leave you. The key points that I have here was about durability. So I just was sort of hitting on those points in the examples, the last examples that I gave. You could have different levels of durability in communities. That doesn't mean that one is more real than another one. It's an important thing for us to think about here, that you can have interaction with people online, offline, face-to-face, over text. That doesn't define whether or not something is real or not. And it's one of my pet peeves is people talking about real relationships in online spaces and the real world in inverted commas. It's all the real world. I mean, it's all of this is the real world. All of these interactions are real. I'm talking to you through a video and have people watching who are Facebook friends. This isn't imaginary. It's the real world, and there are real people behind the relationships that we have. So it's not to our benefit to downplay them at all and to say that online things are in any way less legitimate than offline things. They're just different, and I think that is a recurring theme in this class, is that things might be different, but that doesn't say anything about their value one way or the other. Social media will continue to challenge our ideas of what is on and offline. But given distance and time and space, we will be unlikely to completely remove those lines. So what I'm saying here is that there's never going to be a complete mutual overlap between online and offline worlds, because we still have distance of time and space. So we will likely, at least in the near to medium future, we'll still be interacting with each other through technology with people who are in some ways not a part of our day-to-day life in the physical sense. Maybe we'll start teleporting around. I don't think that's in our lifetimes. It's in the cards. So we are likely to see the continuation of the kinds of things that we're doing right now, and things were changing very, very quickly in technology for that. The first 10 years of the internet, well, the first 10 years, but from 2000 to 2008 when the smartphone came out. But Facebook, people talk about the durability of online platforms. Facebook has been around for a while now, and enough so that we can remember, your memories come up from 10 years ago and you think, well, it's been a while that I've been using Facebook. In 20 years, maybe I'll come back and watch this video and think to myself, like, oh, wow, this is still there. That's still it's still a part of my life. Maybe not. Maybe Facebook's gonna go away entirely, and we will have a chip put into us that allows us to talk to each other telepathically. But maybe not. Maybe we'll still be making Facebook videos in 10 years and 15 years. Okay. For the class, I'm going to send out an email again about what I expect you to do on Thursday in my absence. I've got my fingers crossed that people will be there and interacting with each other. I'm not going to incentivize you in any way. Like I said in class a couple of weeks ago or last week, we're all adults. I don't need to coax you to come to class. That's not my role. If you don't want to come to class, that's your decision. You should come to class, though. You're paying for it. Does anyone have any questions? Nobody's been chatting at all in the comments. I'm going to take a quick look at my my feed from the online community thing and see if I got any questions. If you can tell me if I did or not. Q&A. No questions have been asked during the session. I also don't see if anybody has been from my class has actually been here. I can only see that I've my Facebook friends have appeared. But I'm going to download this now and post it on YouTube. So I think I will leave it there. Let me check. I'll just check Twitter carefully first to see if anybody had tweeted me any questions there. No, it does not look like we have. So. Okay, good. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for following along. I hope this worked well. We will see when I see my students in after the Easter break. That's the other point I need to make for my students, that you have the class meeting this week from 1 to 2, no class at 3 o'clock. I will see you after Easter when I return from wherever it is I return from. Oh, I'm getting all the emojis now. Thank you very much. Very good. Well, thank you very much. I'll talk to you all later. Have a good week, and thanks for watching.